Being conscious of time, we'll go ahead and get started this morning with our introduction. So thanks to all the attendees for joining this morning, afternoon, evening, from wherever you're joining from. So our presentation today, our webinar today is titled iJedi in a Global Green Recovery. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. So before we get started with our presentations, I'm going to just cover a couple housekeeping items. My name is Isabel, by the way. I am one of the communications coordinators for the USAID and NREL partnership. So a couple of the housekeeping items about this platform, this Zoom platform and the event today. The webinar is being recorded. It will be shared with attendees in the next couple of days. We'll also have it posted on the NREL Learning channel. So keep an eye out for that. We'll send a follow-up with the deck, the recording, all of that good stuff. To adjust audio, if you're having any issues with your audio, you can listen from two different means. So your computer audio, which is sort of the default. If you're having any issues, check your audio settings. You can find it in the Zoom toolbar, and just check your sound output and volume and make sure that it's not coming through a Bluetooth speaker somewhere in your house or something like that. You can also dial in and listen by phone. So the dial-in numbers can be found in your registration confirmation email. If you're having any issues, just try the opposite method of audio that you initially tuned in for. To ask a question, I want to point out that there is a distinct question and answer function in Zoom, so it is distinct from the chat. We will have about 15 minutes at the end of presentations to cover Q&A with our panel. So please feel free to send in your questions at any time through the question and answer function, and we will have a moderated Q&A at the end of the presentations. And finally, if you do want to make a comment, if you want to introduce yourself via chat or just have any thoughts, do feel free to use the chat function. Again, I just want to clarify that we are trying to direct questions for the panelists to the question and answer function and tool. But feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, to say hi, anything along those lines. So we have a great group of speakers today. We have Jeremy Foster, a senior energy analyst from USAID with us, who will introduce the USAID NREL partnership. We have Liz Gill, a policy and market analyst from NREL, and Liz is also the lead for the iJedi toolkit. We have Tim Reber, who will be providing a demo of iJedi and an overview of using the tool. Tim is also from NREL. And we have Olile Misimanga, a senior researcher from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research from South Africa. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it off to Jeremy Foster to introduce the USAID NREL partnership. So take it away, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate everyone joining our webinar today, and thank you to our speakers and panelists who will be delivering the content. For over 10 years now, the USAID has partnered with NREL and working to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable power to the developing world. We've partnered with NREL with a number of our bilateral programs where partner countries of USAID are looking to find ways to modernize their energy sectors and ways to find ways to increase their use of renewable energy in their units. Through the partnership, we have built a number of global technical toolkits. On the next slide, you'll see links to them, and we can also pass around. 4 of our more prominent ones are the Renewable Energy Explorer, Greening the Grid, the Resilient Energy Platform, and the platform, the toolkit that we're going to talk about today is the International Jobs and Economic Development Impacts Platform. We're excited about the potential for iJedi to be a resource for the international community to plan to promote a green economic recovery. The following presentations will highlight the synergies between climate action and economic growth and the role the iJedi tool can play in providing the information planners and decision makers will need to maximize the positive impact in their communities. I'm now going to pass it off to NREL researcher Liz Gill, who's going to share some information about the context of green economic recovery. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate you taking the time to introduce iJedi and the USAID partnership. We really appreciate you being here. I'm going to just quickly lay the groundwork, provide some context about, why are we talking about a green economic recovery and the role iJedi can play in those efforts. So if we could go to the next slide. So we first want to talk about just what economic impacts have we seen from COVID-19. The world economy has contracted by 3.5% in 2020. That's according to a recent Brookings report. And the World Bank estimates that upwards of 90% of world economies experienced negative GDP impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated recession. And it's also estimated that the pandemic hit oil exporting developing economies disproportionately hard. And we can see from this figure on this slide that there's been a major impact on economics of economies around the world. So that's just laying a little bit of the groundwork for where we sit currently economically. Okay, move to the next slide. We want to talk a little bit more about the regional GDP impacts from COVID-19. So as you can see from this chart, emerging economies in Asia, excluding China, Latin American and Caribbean countries, and sub-Saharan African countries were hit the hardest from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's great opportunity across the world to make some strategic investments to spur economic growth, create jobs, and we'll dive into that a little bit more here on the next slide. So we want to talk about the connection between renewable energy and economic development. And IRENA estimates that trillions in US dollars will need to be invested in renewables and efficiency over the next decade to reach our nationally determined contributions by 2030. And that's just the 2030 investments. There is a new report that came out recently that said that upwards of $131 trillion will need to be invested in the next coming decades to reach 2050 goals. So those are huge numbers, huge amounts of investments that need to be made. And those benefits are not only economic growth, but also economic diversification and resilience. And we're pulling a lot of this information from two IRENA reports that we want to make sure that we acknowledge. And that's the Global Renewables Outlook and their energy transformation to 2050. And they also published a report called the Post-COVID Recovery: An Agenda for Resilience, Development, and Equality. I highly recommend these two resources. They're super informative. And this chart on this slide is directly from one of those reports, or from the Global Outlook report. And it's showing the change we've seen over the last 20 years or so. And it's rather dramatic. So this chart is showing the foreign direct investment in renewables. First in Q1 of 2005, we can see there's disproportionate investment in oil and gas, very little investment in renewable energy. Fast forward to the first quarter of 2020, we see that that trend has reversed, and now we're seeing more investment in renewable energy and a decreasing investment in oil and gas. So that's just setting the stage a little bit for where is investment in renewable energy. Next slide. So going more explicitly into what are the impacts. So we talk a lot about the impacts of jobs. And in these reports by IRENA, there's essentially a comparison of two scenarios. One is the transforming energy scenario, essentially making the investments that we believe we need to make in order to reach our goals by 2050, and a planned energy scenario, which is essentially business as usual. And in the transforming energy scenario, as we can see in this first chart, there's essentially a net gain of 5.5 million jobs in the renewables, energy efficiency, and power grid and energy flexibility sectors, and a net loss of 1 million jobs in fossil fuels and nuclear. However, that means we're looking at a $4.5 million net gain in jobs between the two scenarios. And when we translate that to GDP, the percent GDP difference, if we were to invest in that transformative scenario, is 1.3% increase over the planned energy scenario. So we just wanted to illustrate, what are the GDP impacts, what are the job impacts of potentially investing in renewables across the world. So next slide. And now just bringing that back to iJeti and why we're here today, and what iJeti's role can be in a green recovery. And we want to stress that iJeti isn't going to solve all the problems or give all the answers, but it can be an important piece of a plan or an analysis to understand how we can move towards a green recovery. So specifically, it can enable countries to quantify jobs and economic impact of different renewable energy investments. And through that, it can serve as a decision support resource. So it can give you the information that a country or an institution needs to understand the impacts of different investments, and through that design a green economic recovery program that connects economic recovery, growth, and climate action. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move into the more technical slides around iJEDI, but these can be customizable to the specific country's context and needs, what they're interested in working with NREL. So next slide. So we did want to provide a few examples of how the tool is being used around the world. We will have the example from South Africa later in the presentation, but we wanted to provide a few others. So the first is in Mexico, where Ithaca Environmental, a local consulting company in Mexico, with the support of the German Corporation for International Cooperation, performed an assessment of 2 possible renewable energy deployment scenarios. And that analysis was actually presented at the UN 2019 COP. And we thought it was a great example of how these iJEDI analysis can be used to aid decision makers. And a similar example in Zambia at the Center for Energy, Environment and Engineering Zambia, NREL trained a team to carry out economic impact and mitigation assessments, incorporating modeling tools, including iJEDI, and then also worked with them to come up with communication strategies to relay critical information to policymakers about the proposed policies and outcomes of the analysis. Next slide. So I'll just wrap up here by giving a plug to a community of practice that NREL is a part of and that we want to help promote. And it's this community of practice, Leeds GP, is looking to address the needs for assistance in implementing integrated climate and socially inclusive green recovery actions. And the activities of this community of practice include peer learning, so trainings and workshops, country-led cooperation, thought leadership, case studies, things of that nature, and then peer-to-peer technical assistance. And this community of practice is open to all interested members. So if you have any interest in this community of practice, please let us know. Please feel free to reach out to me directly, and we would be happy to connect you. Next slide. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Tim Reber, who is international programs project lead at NREL, to walk you through the technical aspects of the iJEDI tool.
Super, thanks Liz, and thanks Jeremy before that. Yeah, so we can go on to the next slide, I guess. So as Liz was mentioning, just a little bit of sort of context and background about kind of how iJEDI was developed and why it was developed. I'm sure as everybody on the line here today is well aware, countries are really looking more and more to align their energy goals with development goals. And sort of speaking this language of being able to translate energy outcomes back to jobs and economic impacts, particularly now more than ever in the sort of the post-COVID recovery, green recovery context, is becoming more and more important. And so this was a context that we developed iJEDI. Go ahead to the next slide, please. And so what is iJEDI? So iJEDI, as Jeremy had mentioned and Liz mentioned, is the International Jobs and Economic Development Impacts Tool. And it does, at least we like to hope it does, exactly what it says, is really help quantify those economic impacts from both building and operating large-scale renewable energy projects. It's recently been translated into a new online platform. The link is right there, www.i-jedi.org. So we encourage you all to go visit and get into a little bit of a demo here in a moment. You can hopefully follow along once you're able to get online and access the tool there. Just a little bit of background. So it was first actually developed for applications in the United States, going back about a decade or so. And under the guidance of the USAID NREL partnership with our friend Jeremy and our friend Jen Leash, who I think is actually on the call today here, developed out the US version into the international JEDI tool to help our partner countries better understand what are these impacts, these economic and employment impacts of renewable energy projects. The tool, it's actually a fairly simple tool at its core. It's based on an input-output social accounting matrix principles. And what it really looks like, as you can see there at the bottom, is it's quite simple. You put in sort of the size of your project, be it a solar project, wind project, a bioenergy project, geothermal project, also adding some new technologies. Put it into the tool and it will kick out those regional economic development metrics, looking at jobs, looking at what are the wages and earnings paid to those workers, and some of the economic total economic output and GDP metrics of the tool. If we go to the next slide. So for those of you who are able to go to the JEDI website, again, that's www.i-jedi.org. You'll see this screen. I'll be going through a demo in a little bit, so I won't spend too much time here on this slide, but you can see it prompts you with a couple of easy inputs and a few tabs up there at the top, which I'll be going through in a moment, but just wanted to make you all aware of what you should be seeing if and when you log into the iJedi website. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So before getting into the demo, I did want to give just a brief sort of background on what exactly is this input-output model. How does it work? As I mentioned, iJedi is actually hopefully a fairly simple and easy to use tool at its core, but really understanding what's going into it and what's coming out of it so that you can set it up properly and, more importantly, actually interpret and understand the results coming out of it is really important. And so I wanted to spend just a few minutes going through some of this input-output background. So if we go to the next slide, please. So for those who might not be familiar, so what is an input-output model? Well, at its core, what an input-output model does is it estimates the effects of one commercial activity, for example, constructing a renewable energy project. It estimates the impacts of that activity and breaks it down into sort of the smaller components of that economic activity, and then simulates all the small transactions going on within a certain economy in a specific region to understand how is that commercial activity having sort of a ripple effect and a broader effect throughout the entire economy. So there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight here about IO models. So the first is that it really is a regional model. So we're looking at only what are the impacts within the certain confines of a certain area. So in the case of iJedi, this is mostly usually a national model. So looking at within the confines of a certain country, what are those inputs? So if you're doing a commercial activity in importing components, some of that economic activity will stay in the country, but if you're importing it, some of it will go outside of the country, and those impacts are not captured in an IO model. The second thing I wanted to mention about IO models is that it does break down these activities into their component parts. So if you can see there at the top right, for example, the manufacturing of an automobile. You can imagine that if we break down an automobile into its components like headlights, wheels, nuts and bolts, and so forth, what the IO model is actually doing is saying, well, what are the economic activities required to manufacture these component parts, to procure them, then put them together into a car and ultimately deliver that automobile to the user. And all of the different economic activities and microtransactions within that sort of supply chain process are quantified in an IO model. And so down there at the bottom, you can imagine we have a certain economic activity. So in this case, for the case of iJedi, of course, we're looking at development of renewable energy projects. You have an immediate stimulus into the economy in a few different sectors. So for example, construction and manufacturing in the case of renewable energy projects. You put this into the IO model and it will simulate those effects across the entire economy, not just the construction and manufacturing sector, and then let you know and kick out what are those impacts in terms of jobs, wages, earnings, GDP, and so forth across all the different sectors. And it looks at this under three sort of different categories of outputs: direct impacts, indirect impacts, and induced impacts, which we'll go through here in just a moment. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the first set of any impacts of these direct impacts, and you can think about these as sort of the project development impacts. So if you're going to be constructing a new PV project, you can imagine you have workers who are actually on site installing the PV project. You have engineers who have to design the project and all that labor that goes in, and then you have to actually procure the raw materials and the pieces, so the PV modules, the racking. So all of these sort of immediate sort of on-site project development related activities are going to be captured in what we call these direct impacts of iJedi. Now, the next category is called indirect impacts. And so if we go to the next slide, you see we have these indirect, and this is basically what we like to think of as sort of supply chain. And so you can imagine that the engineers who are designing the PV plant, they have to procure software and buy software from somewhere to actually help in the design of the system. You have to procure raw materials that go into actually manufacturing the PV panels and the other equipment. And then, of course, you also have workers along the supply chain as well who are responsible for actually manufacturing and putting together the components that are ultimately procured and put into the final product. And so the second category of impacts is this indirect or sort of supply chain impacts. And these are also going to be captured in the iJeti input-output model. And then the final is what we call induced effects. And so these induced effects, if we go to the next slide, please. These induced effects are basically all of the earnings that any workers across the entire supply chain make when they go and spend their hard-earned dollars that they make on other activities within the economy. These are the induced effects. So you can imagine a worker, for example, goes and he takes his family out for dinner. That will be an induced effect that's represented in the IO model as something that's helping stimulate the economy. Or for example, a worker who is responsible for manufacturing equipment along the supply chain goes and takes her family on a vacation. Those are induced effects. So basically the effects of any earnings or wages paid to workers across the project development supply chain life cycle, those are captured as well in this sort of induced effect category. So we have these three categories: direct, indirect, and induced effects. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And so just another way to visualize it, you can kind of see that any economic activity, including, of course, developing a renewable energy project, is going to kind of have this ripple effect throughout the economy where you have, yes, of course, your on-site direct project development impacts, but those are going to kind of magnify and get larger and larger and ripple and have a larger effect throughout the economy. And that's really what we like to see and are trying to capture in the iJeti tool, is these broad effects. So if we go to the next slide. So what actually goes into making this? So this slide summarizes both the inputs and outputs. As I mentioned, again, iJeti is a fairly simple and straightforward tool. It does not require a whole lot in terms of inputs. Once you've identified your country or your particular area of interest that you're looking at, the only thing you really need to enter is the project size. So whether it's a solar project, wind project, geothermal, bioenergy, put in the size. You also need to define those component costs and operation and maintenance costs. So as I mentioned, the IO model really works by breaking down a single project into its smaller subcomponents. We, of course, have default data included in that. So if you don't have those, you can quickly go in and start doing analysis right away with those default costs. But if you do have more specific local costs for your particular region, you can enter those. And then the last and final piece, and this is really important, is understanding the proportion of labor and expenditure for each of these components that actually happens in country. So again, this IO model is really a regional, localized, captures regional and localized impacts. And in order to do that, we need to know, are you manufacturing all your solar panels in country, or are you importing them all? Because that's going to impact how much of that economic benefit, how many of those jobs actually stay within your defined region or defined country, and how much is going to be sort of exported. And then once you've put these inputs in, it kicks out these different outputs. So again, these direct, indirect, and induced outputs. And then the four main types, which is jobs, captured in what we call full-time equivalents or job years. So basically how many person employed for one full year. The earnings, so the wages that are paid to those workers, to those jobs. A measure of gross output, which is really captures sort of the overall economic activity throughout the entire economy, so sort of gross revenue. And then finally GDP, which is really just your value add at the end of the day. So if we go to the next slide, please. We can start looking at kind of how these results come together. So next slide. So you can imagine now we have these four different types of output. So these jobs, earnings, economic output, and GDP. And then we have these three different categories. So we can put those together and you see we have sort of this results matrix down there at the bottom. So for each of these different stages in the supply chain, the direct or project development, the indirect or supply chain, and then the induced, which again is sort of workers spending their income. across these different categories of the economy, you get this output matrix. But we're not quite done there. If you go to the next slide, please. We also have to think about the time horizon. So in any project development, there's really two different phases. There's the construction phase, and then of course the long-term operation phase. And iJedi also breaks down these different results matrices and these results outputs by these two timelines. So for construction, you can imagine any renewable energy project, you're going to have a lot of activity, a lot of jobs supported, a lot of economic stimulus, but probably for a fairly short time horizon, maybe a couple of months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years if it's a larger project, but it's going to be a very intense, short-term, limited sort of impact. And then, of course, you have the longer-term operation, sort of annual upkeep. And iJedi is going to kick out and provide results for both of these two different phases of the project development life cycle. And then if we go to the next slide, please. And then the final thing is, not only does it provide these impacts at the whole economy level, you can also get in and actually see within individual sectors where are the impacts the greatest. And so the interesting thing I think to look at here is, so for these direct impacts for a particular renewable energy project, with this example, you would expect a lot of economic activity in sort of the construction and manufacturing industries, as those are the ones that are really involved in project development. And surely enough, we can see here that for this particular example, utilities, construction, and some of the financial and business services are the ones impacted most for sort of those on-site impacts. But then as we start moving to the indirect and then onto the induced impacts of this particular example, you can see that the impacts, in this case, the number of jobs being supported, kind of start increasing for other sectors of the economy as well. So that's where we get kind of that ripple effect and that magnifying effect throughout the economy, where a single stimulus just in construction ultimately will ripple throughout the whole economy. So I think that's what I have for you in terms of background. I did want to now share my screen and give it just a very brief demo of iJedi. So this up. So hopefully you are all seeing my screen now. Isabel, please let me know if it's not showing. I'll assume it is. So when you go to, again, www.i-jedi.org, you'll land here at this, you should land here at this About page, which provides a little bit of just background on the iJedi tool. I quickly will go through some of these main tabs, and then the main sort of core of the tool is here at Run. But before we go and actually walk through a demonstration, I wanted to point out a couple other areas. So first of all, if you come to this Resources and Training tab, you'll see a whole bunch of resources available, a fact sheet, a user guide, which will actually be able to walk you through an older version of iJedi, which is actually in spreadsheet form, if you'd like to download that, which gives you a little bit more control over kind of modifying and doing some more advanced features with it. Some tutorials and other background information that should be really helpful for those of you who are interested in learning more. If you've gone to the Resources and Training page and you still have questions, you can also come up here to the Ask an Expert. You can contact some of NREL's experts. We partnered with USAID to be able to provide an on-demand assistance platform. So for those of you who may be interested in actually adapting iJedi, using iJedi at home, you can come to this Ask an Expert page and ask questions and get some of NREL's team online to help you actually walk through the tool. And localize it for your particular context. But right now we're going to go here. So we're going to click on the Run tab. This is sort of the meat of the tool. And what you'll see here is this landing page. So you probably should remember this from the slides just a few minutes ago. It prompts you with a couple of very, very simple inputs. So the first thing it's going to ask you is define your country. We have a handful of countries already entered in from previous work we've done. So you can either select one of the 5 countries that we have default information for, or if you want, you can also, and I suspect this would be the case for many of you, you can actually click here to choose a custom region or define your own custom region. This is going to be slightly more advanced because it will require you to bring in your own input-output tables. But we're happy to work with those of you who are interested in doing this, again, through this Ask an Expert platform to help you figure out how to do that. For this example, though, we're just going to pick a country. We'll go ahead and let's say the Philippines. The next thing it prompts you is to choose your technology. So right now we have 4 default technologies in there: bioenergy, geothermal, solar PV, and wind technology. So for this demo, maybe we'll just pick solar PV. I think folks are most familiar with that, and that's what we ran through earlier. You need to pick your dollar year. It's important because all of the dollar years for the default costs need to be referenced to the same year to account for inflation. So you can pick any of the default dollar years here. I always just personally pick the most recent. So right now what we have is 2015 costs, and so we'll pick that. And then you can come here and enter in your project size. So if you want to say you're planning a 10 megawatt solar PV program or 100 megawatts, we'll just leave it at 100 megawatts for now, but you define the size of your project. So once you've entered this, you can click Start Scenario. One other thing I'll mention very quickly. If you want to save your scenario, you are given the option to register. For now, we'll just use it as a guest for the purposes of this demo, but you can actually register as a user, log in, and it will save all of your different scenarios, which will make running multiple scenarios and doing comparisons much easier. So once you've logged in and registered and logged in, and then define sort of your main parameters, you just click here and click Start Scenario. Takes a moment to load, and it will bring you to this screen. And so as you remember, one of the core pieces of information you need to input is the different component costs for all of the components of the project. And then also this % manufactured in country, which you will see here on the right side. And so it'll take us through different aspects of project development and ask us to define the costs for these. So first is defining your PV modules. Again, it has default costs in here. So this is assuming for 100 megawatts of PV, about 66 million US dollars for that, that quantity of PV. So for the modules, what are the component costs? And then also what are the % manufactured in this country? In this particular example, we're assuming that none of it is manufactured in country, and so we can leave this at 0. But you could imagine running a scenario where it said, well, let's say the Philippines wants to develop its own PV manufacturing industry. What would be the economic benefits of that? Well, you could come here and do 2 scenarios and say run one scenario with 0% manufactured in country, and another one where you say, let's say 75% is manufactured in country. You could run these 2 different scenarios and then understand what would be the impacts of the sort of the economic benefit of investing in developing that domestic manufacturing capability. For now, though, we'll just leave the defaults. And so you come here, and so for your PV equipment, you define your modules, you define your inverter costs, the % manufactured in country, and then the purchases. So again, this last one here, purchases, is really looking at, do you have local distributors who are distributing PV components locally, or are they all being imported? In this case, we'll just leave that as no, because that's the default value, but you can define either yes or no for that, and kind of how much or what dollar value of those purchases are being made by local distributors. So once you define your equipment, you can click here next. Then you have the installation part of the project where you'll be asked to input construction costs. And so this is the cost of actually installing the equipment. And so for this, you can see 100% of these costs are occurring in country, because most of the laborers, most of the workers who are hired to actually install this system will be local domestic workers. And so this here is going to be 100%, as this is where a lot of the local wages will be paid to those workers installing the components. And again, we have default costs in here based on previous work with the Philippines, but you can of course enter and define your own costs if you would like. Then you go on to the next piece, which is this other category, and this is a lot of project design and sort of business related costs. And so you have design and civil engineering services, costs paid to the folks responsible for designing the system. Again, defaults for all of these. In this case, we're assuming maybe a 50-50 partnership between an international firm and a local domestic firm responsible for engineering and designing the system. Other costs, things like overhead, business, soft costs for paying legal fees, certification, and so forth. What are some of those business related costs? Infrastructure, the cost of developing new infrastructure. So if you actually have to pay for new power lines, transmission lines, roads out to the site and whatnot, those costs will be factored in here as well. And then transportation, if there's specific transportation costs associated with getting equipment out to the site. So we can enter all those, either use the default values or enter your own individual values. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle is the annual operations and maintenance. And here it's pretty simple. You define both the maintenance and repair services, so the cost of labor for workers to operate and maintain the system, and then also the cost of replacement parts. And again, important to think about the breakdown in how these are distributed within country. Most of the maintenance and repair services will be probably occurring with local workers. That's at 90%. Most of the repair parts, in this example, we're assuming the Philippines does not have domestic manufacturing, so most of the repair parts also have to be imported. So that's at 0. But again, if you were looking at, say, a scenario of if the Philippines were to develop its own domestic industry, this would be, you would enter a much higher percent purchased in country for this. So those are all the inputs. Again, there's default data for all of these that you can use, or you can define your own. Once you've put all this information in here, you just go ahead and click run, and it takes a moment. It's an online platform, and it will kick out this results page here. And hopefully, if I did my job right, this should look somewhat familiar. And so you can see now we have these sort of results matrices. And what this is showing is we have the immediate impacts both for this construction phase, so kind of this one-time impact, and then also the ongoing operation and maintenance. And we have results for the number of jobs supported, the earnings or wages paid to those workers, the gross output or sort of cumulative economic activity, and then the GDP or value add, basically. And again, we have this for these direct or sort of project development, indirect or supply chain impacts, and then induced impacts, which is workers spending their income on other activities in the economy. As to be expected, the jobs and economic impact supported during the construction phase is significantly higher than for the annual operation and maintenance. This is a solar project, so I think one of the reasons we like solar and the costs are low is that those annual O&M costs are much lower and easier to maintain. So you can see there's only maybe 28 annual jobs supported, but about 2,500 jobs immediately supported, at least on site, once for construction. The other thing I'll mention here is that for the construction phase, again, remember, we're talking about these sort of full-time equivalents. So this is 2,500 jobs, assuming one person employed for 1 year. That's independent of how long it actually takes to construct the system. So if it takes only 6 months to construct the system, you still need this 2,500 full-time equivalents of labor. So you can imagine if it only takes half a year to install the system, but you're employing 2,500 full-time year equivalents or job years, you'll actually be employing about 5,000 people just for that half year in order to get to this 2,500 full-time year equivalents. On the flip side, let's say it takes extra long to install the system, say 2 years. Well, in that case, you'll actually need to divide this in half because you're only employing about 1,250 people for 1 year each. Cumulatively over 2 years, that gets you to this 2,500 full-time equivalents. And so you need to kind of adjust for how long your construction phase actually is. As the construction phase here, the results here assume just over 1 year. Annual and O&M is much easier. This is just as it says, every single year, this is how many jobs are supported, the wages paid, the gross domestic output, and the GDP. So I think the final thing I'll flag here is then you can scroll down, and again, you can get to these detailed impacts. You can click on jobs, click on earnings, gross output, or GDP, and you can actually see a breakdown across sectors of where those impacts are happening, both for the immediate construction phase and then also for the ongoing operation and maintenance phase. And again, as I mentioned, as one would expect, is that the direct phase, again, sort of project development, construction, you have a lot of input in the utilities, construction, business, financial, professional business services for things like engineering. And then as you move on to these ripple effects, you start seeing more balanced impacts across the rest of the economy. So I think I'm about at time. I know that was very quick. We typically do a much more detailed sort of course and training on this, but hopefully this gives a very high level idea and overview of kind of what goes into iJedi, how it works, how to understand what's coming out of it, and at least enough so that you can go in and get started playing around with it yourself. we really encourage you to visit this resources and training page if you want to learn more, or if you're actually interested in deploying the tool and using the tool in some of your work. You can come to this Ask an Expert or reach out, and we'll be happy to find ways to assist and help you a little bit in more detail. So with that, I'll stop, and I think I'll hand it back to Liz, who's gonna introduce our next speaker, who will actually give us a bit of a case study on how iJedi was used and deployed in South Africa.
Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate you walking through this. Super helpful, I'm sure, for everyone here. And I have the honor of introducing our next speaker. As Tim mentioned, Olile Masmanga is a senior researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research Energy Center, and she's a part of the energy industry team there. She has several years of experience in energy-related research and modeling and analysis on the African continent. She was formerly a part of McKinsey & Company's Africa Research and Insights team, and she's conducted research into various energy sector topics across Africa, more specifically research on renewable energy, electric power, electrification, oil and gas, and infrastructure. In South Africa specifically, she has worked on projects for public and private sector clients in the energy space, and has a deep interest in the just energy transition, off-grid electrification, renewable energy, and power sector regulation. To enhance her expertise, she is currently pursuing a master's in management and energy leadership at Wits Business School. So we're very lucky to have her expertise, and we're really excited to hear your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, greetings wherever you are. Like Liz said, I'm Olile Masmanga, and I'm a senior researcher at the CSIR. This is, next slide, please. Basically, this is the agenda for my presentation for today. So I'm going to give a brief introduction and historical context of the CSIR as an organization, and then the CSIR's relationship and how we came about using the iJedi tool. And then I'll go into a bit of the South African context of the power sector and the application of iJedi to look at employment effects and their economic impact, and then going to give it a few case examples of projects where we've used iJedi for our client projects as well as internal. Next slide, please. So next slide again, sorry. So the CSIR is a leading scientific and technological research organization that researches, develops, localizes, and diffuses technologies to accelerate socioeconomic prosperity in South Africa. Our work contributes to industrial development and supports a capable state. We were established through an act of parliament, so we're actually an independent organization that's within the construct of the government, and the executive authority of the CSIR is the Department of Science and Innovation. And the CSIR as an organization plays a key role in supporting public and private sectors through detailed research that is aligned with the country's priorities, our mandate, which is on the screen, and our science, engineering, and technology competencies. Next slide, please. Our strategic objectives. So as mentioned, we conduct research, development, and innovation of transformative technologies and accelerate their diffusion into the country as well as other regions in Africa. We collaboratively improve the competitiveness of high impact industries to support South Africa's re-industrialization, which you'll see later why that is important. We drive socioeconomic transformation. So beyond the science, we also look at the socioeconomic transformation through the RD&I that we do that supports the development of the capable state. And then we build and transform human capital infrastructure, and as an organization, diversify income and maintain financial sustainability and good governance. Next slide, please. We have several clusters. I'm from the energy industry team, which sits in the smart places cluster, but we have several other clusters which look at varying topics. So we look at manufacturing, we look at mining, we look at chemicals, we look at agriculture. So we look at health as well. So we look at different topic areas in the science space and try to contribute to the South African landscape with quality research to take the country forward. Next slide, please. So the context of the CSIR and iJedi. So a couple of years ago, the CSIR collaborated with USAID, NREL, and the 21st Century Power Partnership to adapt the iJedi model for South Africa. Through the partnership, 2 of our staff were dispatched for a 2-week fellowship at NREL in the States, and were trained to use the iJedi through a train-the-trainer approach. And thereafter, they learn how to use and have been passing on the learnings within the CSIR as well as outside. And the CSIR is now using the tool to perform analysis related to South Africa's integrated resource plan, which I'll talk about later, and informing public discussions around the IRP and the energy transition, which is important for South Africa because we are such a coal dependent country. And as mentioned, there are several projects where we've used the iJedi to inform employment impact. Next slide, please. So beyond the renewable energy technologies that Tim spoke about earlier, we've also added additional technologies because to tailor the model to our region, we have a lot of coal. So we needed to understand what the impacts of coal in terms of jobs as well and economic impacts are, because at some point we needed to make a comparison between the renewable energy development and the coal power sector as well. So that came about, and then we added natural gas. And then lastly, there was the addition of biopower and solar distributed generation as well. So it's based on engagement with people, where the gaps are, and then through the help and of course the work at NREL, they helped us add customize the iJedi tool for our own purposes. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to just give a bit of a brief background on South Africa's power sector and the application of iJedi. So basically, the iJedi tool provided South Africa, or CSIR, representing South Africa, a platform to quantify job impact from decarbonizing the power sector. Historically and currently, employment in the power sector is concentrated in the coal power generation, specifically in the Mpumalanga region. In 2010, the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan that I mentioned earlier, was published. That was the first one. And it provides basically a capacity plan for the power sector in South Africa based on different technologies. And within the first plan that was published, 17.8 gigawatts was assigned to renewable energy, which was unheard of. And very exciting for everyone who is in the sector, because it meant that we were shifting our view and our plans for our power sector from being a primarily coal-based country to a more diversified one. And this provided the backdrop for the establishment of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, which in a nutshell is basically an auctioning procurement mechanism where bid windows are held, and then the renewable energy is then procured by different independent power producers, and it allowed for private sector participation in generation. And then at the onset, and hence why we needed the iJedi tool, minimal knowledge on job creation was available, and iJedi provided an ideal platform to address this. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, you'll see the gray is basically, this is basically the electricity production in South Africa by source since 1985. And as you can see, as a country, we've been heavily reliant on coal, as well as nuclear, but I mean, nuclear is okay, I think. And then you have oil and gas as well. And renewables was basically non-existent. It was less than 1% of our installed capacity. But from the auction program, when it was introduced in 2011, the capacity was procured, and then from 2013, as projects came online, we got more and more renewable energy being added to our production, and we're going in the same direction, as you will see, as we reduce our reliance on coal. Next slide, please. Furthermore, South Africa has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, if not the highest. I think as of this year, we have the highest unemployment rate in the world because of several reasons, including the COVID-19 impact. And so because of this, and because of the impact of transitioning from coal to renewable energy, we needed to understand what the impact on employment is going to be, because it's so sensitive for our economy. And so the NREL IJDI tool was key in terms of us trying to understand what the employment impacts are going to be. Next slide, please. So for the road to the just transition that we've been taking, we've been looking at four specific areas: the environmental effects, the social effects, the technical effects, and the cost effects, as well as the economic effects. Next slide, please. IJDI basically falls into the economic effects bucket, where we're looking at the employment effects, we're looking at the macroeconomic effects, and it provided us as an organization a tool to fulfill this part of our mandate in terms of the just transition. Next slide, please. So now the exciting part, I guess. We've done several projects. I'm just highlighting the ones that are the most recent projects that we've published. And so you can actually go look at the results that came out of the studies. And except for the first one, that one was, I think, internal. So that one's unavailable, but the next two are available, the last two. So next slide, please. So as mentioned, the IRP is the plan for South Africa's power sector. We've had several versions of it. And the whole idea is to have an updated IRP every couple of years. So the first one was in 2010 and the most recent one was in 2019. And this one is based on the 2019 IRP. And so looking at the IRP 2019, you can see that there is a plan to phase out coal slowly but surely and increase the amount of renewable energy. And so ultimately, what does that actually mean for employment in the country? That's always a concern, and that's what's always being discussed. Next slide, please. So you'll see here we quantified the resulting jobs coming out of the IJDI tool. So firstly, it was what are the jobs that are going to be lost in the coal sector, the coal power sector, and then will the renewable energy procurement be able to replace the job losses? And so in the end, it was after doing the IJDI assessments, you can see that there will be a significant job loss. Around 46,000 jobs will be lost during the next 10 years. But that said, the renewable energy procurement will more than offset the amount of jobs that are going to be lost. So at the end of the day, you have more jobs being created at a national level. So hence, if you look at the action title, you'll see that we're saying that yes, renewable energy will provide jobs, but it's not the only solution, especially for a country like South Africa, which has been heavily reliant on one source of energy for a very long time. Next slide, please. The next project, or rather client that we used the IJDI tool for was the the co-benefits project. And this was done for the German government through the IKI program. And it's been implemented in 4 countries, so India, South Africa, Vietnam, and Turkey. And we're currently doing the last report for the co-benefits program. And I'll detail that one next. And basically the aim of the co-benefits projects is to identify, prioritize, and analyze country-specific co-benefits of climate mitigation policies with emphasis on the opportunities presented by renewable energy power generation. So that's the whole idea. And so we've used the iJedi tool in 2 of the co-benefits studies. So the first one, which has been completed, is the future skills and job creation through renewable energy, which once you get the presentation, you can see for yourself. Then the one that we're currently doing is the employment effects, skills requirements, and job creation related to repurposing of coal-fired power plants in Mpumalanga. Mpumalanga is the province in South Africa which is the most impacted by the whole just energy transition, because that's where most of the coal power plants are concentrated. Next slide, please. So for the first one that is available publicly, the future skills and job creation through renewable energy in SA. So the study analyzes the employment impact of different plans for expanding electricity generation in South Africa. It presents the resulting employment effects within the electricity sector, primarily focusing on coal and renewable energy sources. So something similar to what I was talking about earlier in the IRP analysis. It also provides an initial assessment of the skill attainment levels required for South Africa's energy transition and the potential for workers to transfer from the coal sector to the emerging renewable energy sector. And so the iJedi tool was used for the gross employment effects, and that was then other methods were used for the net employment impact and the qualitative assessment on job creation, which is basically the skills. Next slide, please. So for the results, it was found that South Africa can significantly boost employment by increasing the share of renewables. No brainer. Employment can be expected to increase by an additional 40% in the period between 2018 and 2030 from the IRP 2016, which is the first bar, to 2018, which accounts for 580,000 job years, which is a lot. If you think about it, for South Africa, it makes a big difference. And then if you become even more aggressive with the amount of renewable energy, you'll see that like in the CSIR, these cost pathway, that number almost reaches 1.2 million jobs. So it even more than doubles. So it's quite powerful, and it's quite a powerful tool in that sense, because you can see just by changing the amount of renewable energy, how much impact you can have on jobs in a country. And then furthermore, the part that we really also rely on is the sectoral view to show actually where the investment is gonna end up going to per technology. Next slide, please. And then currently we're doing the study I was mentioning earlier, where we're looking at a national level. There will be plenty of jobs that are created, and they will potentially replace all the job losses from coal. But at a regional level, what is the actual impact of renewable energy? How much is it going to move the needle for the region that's actually going to be impacted the most? Where out of all the coal power plants in Africa, more than, I think it's about, how many is it? I think it's about 12 are actually in Mpumalanga, and that in total there are about 14. So it's quite a large amount that are in the actual province. And if you're looking at the what's it called, the capacity, South Africa's current installed capacity is about 57 gigawatts, and the coal is about 80% or 90% of that. So it's quite a large share that they have in the province. Next slide, please. So in this particular study, which we're embarking on, there's several scenarios, IRP being one of them, so I won't go through it again. But in each scenario, there is increasing amounts of decommissioning to show what the impact of decommissioning is, one, on job losses, and then what the impact of having an increased share of renewables is on the job losses in the region. And so the hope is that the results from the study will then inform policy and help the local government make informed decisions about where jobs are going to be created and how much of those jobs are going to be created, and what other sectors can actually be leveraged to replace the jobs that will be lost in the coal value chain. Next slide, please. Then the most recent published study is the solar PV industry jobs report, which was done for the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association. It was published in April this year, and essentially it had a very interesting methodology in that there was a review of literature to look at where, like, what literature is saying about jobs per megawatt for solar along the value chain, and then after that, contacting companies in South Africa to say, as an IPP, as a OEM, how many jobs per megawatt in the value chain do you create, or do you have, rather? And then once that was done, numbers were converged, jobs per megawatt was converged on, and then based on several scenarios, the job creation potential was then calculated. To validate this, next slide, please. The iJedi tool was deployed, and you'll see the correlation between the iJedi tool and the real world. The real world results are on top, so graph 1, and then the iJedi results are at the bottom, which is graph 2. And so the validation exercise shows that the methodology employed in the study aligns well with iJedi, and also vice versa. iJedi as a tool aligns well with real world data. And that's how we've been using it at the CSIR so far. And I'm sure we'll use it again for other studies that use static models for their analysis of job impact of renewable energy, as well as the other technologies that are covered in the tool. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. It was great to hear how South Africa has been utilizing iJedi. We really appreciate you being here. And there was a few questions that came in for you on the chat as well. So we are going to transition to the Q&A portion of our discussion here. Please feel free to keep adding questions in the chat throughout the next few minutes here, and we will get to as many as we can. Tim, I'm going to start with you, if that is okay. I had a question come in about not just quantity, but quality of jobs. If there's any way for iJedi to address not only, FTE, but what the quality of those jobs are like. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question we've had before. I think the closest that iJedi can get is through looking at what sectors those jobs are in. So it does have that sectoral breakdown. You can look at, say, professional business services, finance, which usually, maybe pay a little bit higher, and then other sectors, agriculture, things like that, which maybe, are different skill sets. Within individual sectors, there's not really a good way to sort of break down within iJedi. I think you can certainly do some sort of follow-on analysis on your own. But probably the closest we can get right now is just looking at which sectors those jobs are in.
Great, thank you. Olile, we had a question come in about what South Africa is doing in regards to the plans and programs they have to start new skills training, and just to build off your conversation and what potentially the iJedi analysis spurred. Is there Is there any plans for job training for that transition, specifically in the regions that you kind of spoke to?
So the current study that I'm on right now, the co-benefits one, has an element of skills to it. So there is definitely a push to see in terms of reskilling and moving people from a coal skills to I wouldn't say renewable energy only, but like other sectors as well as renewable energy. How do we do that? How much of the current coal related, because it's not just the power plants, it's also the coal mines and all those guys. How do we reskill those people and empower them to move on after the power plant closures as well as the mine closures? So it is something that's being looked at by several organizations, not just the co-benefits guys. It's also the UK Pact is also looking at it. The EU is looking at it, as well as the actual Mpumalanga government. So it is something that is top of mind, and is an important aspect to actually try to address.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question, and I'm just going to ask this kind of broadly to both of you, is addressing more directly, how can we use this tool to approach a green recovery? And the question was asked specifically in regards to the United States and infrastructure packages and things of that nature. But Olule, actually, I was interested in if you could speak to how you added coal and natural gas as kind of a comparison, and how you use that to plan for or to illustrate what the impacts of those different types of investments would be. And if you think that from your experience, how that aligns with green recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of countries, South Africa has committed to decarbonizing its power sector. And I think just in general, just decarbonizing. And the power sector is one of those areas where it can have the biggest impact. So having the coal element allows us to have an argument saying, yes, there are a lot of jobs that come from coal, but here's what renewable energy can also do, and other technologies. So people are not just seeing, oh, this heavy focus on renewable energy. They're also seeing that on the other side, yes, we're not denying that there are lots of jobs in coal, but those jobs can also be addressed by shifting to renewable energy. So it's definitely a key conversation, and a conversation that's ongoing. We're trying to bring more rigor to the analysis to relay people's concerns, because you don't want to move from what you know. You like something new is not something that you want to let go of. It's something new you don't want to like start a new life, a new way of thinking. So it's key. Yeah. So thanks.
So there's a couple of kind of specific questions about the mechanics of the tool. And I'll start with if there's been any publicly available iJedi analyses published. And this question came in the context of that this person is doing work in Southeast Asia. It would be useful to see any studies. Has there been any studies done in Southeast Asia that are published, or would the most effective way to get that information be to actually just go into the model and run it yourself?
Well, apart from the excellent work that TSR has done for South Africa, which I think is a fantastic example, we do have, if you go to the website on the Where We Work page, there are some examples there you can pull from. I would also encourage, if there are specific countries in which you're interested, to go ahead and just reach out to us directly, and we can share some. In Southeast Asia, I know it was about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago, we did an analysis using iJedi of rooftop PV actually for Indonesia. And I think that has been published. Don't recall off the top of my head exactly where you can find it, but we can follow up offline and be happy to share some of those studies where we can find them. But short answer is yes, we do have some available, and I encourage, if there are specific questions or topics, you can reach out. We can share some materials.
Great. And just to build on that a little bit, and this question's been answered in some ways, but just to kind of reiterate, there was questions about expanding to other technologies such as offshore wind and rooftop solar that aren't necessarily directly listed. as well as coal and natural gas in the previous example, and how to, is it just getting in touch with NREL, and working with us to integrate those technologies? Is there any technologies that we don't have the capability to do at this point?
I think we can, one of the benefits of the tool is I think once you understand sort of the underlying methodology, and so I spent a lot of time on kind of the IO input output methodology, it's fairly easy and straightforward to adapt it. The web tool has kind of some commonly addressed technologies in it, but if there are other things like offshore wind, like rooftop solar, and others, we're happy to work with folks, with countries, with other interested stakeholders to kind of adapt and make that possible. It's just a little bit more of an involved process, so it's tough to cover in a 1-hour webinar, but we certainly can do that, and absolutely encourage folks to reach out.
Great, thanks. So a question just came in about, and this is essentially similar to the last question, but to get an impact of oxygen supply chain chance. I know that's more of a specified technology. Do you think that like holds true with, really be able to understanding the model, or once we get into those really specific technologies, you might need to work more directly with NREL?
Yeah, oxygen supply plants is a little outside my personal wheelhouse, but I'm sure it's something we could look at through the model, but we definitely need to have a little bit of a follow-up consultation and conversation, which again, we're happy to do.
Great. We've run through most of the questions here. Did want to open it up to kind of the larger audience. If anybody wants to ask a question directly, this would be the opportunity to do so. If not, I think we've answered a couple, great questions, and really appreciate our speakers all being on here today. So is there any questions from the larger group that would like to be asked? All right, seems like there's not. Really appreciate everyone for being here today. We are, once we drop off here, there's a short survey that pops up that we'd really appreciate. It should only take a few minutes that you take. We'll be following up with the webinar materials, the presentation, etc. in the next week or so. And please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any more questions. Yeah, we really appreciate your time, and thank you.